I was really excited when I heard that the theme of this day-long event was going to be the pursuit of progress, because having just been a candidate in an election, I feel that I had some real and direct recent experience in exactly that. My motivation for running to be as a candidate in this past election can really be summed up by today's theme. Because while I was certainly looking to be part of a movement for change, for me, change wasn't enough. What I was really looking for was progress. I grew up in a family with a mother who was a very progressive role model, not only to me, but to all kinds of other countless people, young and old, in this country and elsewhere. Some of you may know who she is. Her name is Louise Arbour, and she's a former Supreme Court judge and United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and International War Crimes prosecutor. But my mother really showed me how you can pursue progress in every aspect of your life without needing to be the head of a UN agency or a high-ranking judicial official. She got those positions because she was really good at pursuing progress in a meaningful way, but those kinds of platforms are certainly not prerequisites for having an impact in your community, in your country, and if you really dream big enough in the world. And my mother taught me a lesson that is very nicely encapsulated by the words of a US civil rights activist called Angela Davis, who said, "I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept." And for me, those are really words to live by, and those words very much guided my decision to stand as a candidate in the election. There's so many different ways that a person can pursue progress in the course of their life, using the tools that are most readily available to them, but also the tools with which they're the most proficient. In my case, having had a background as a lawyer, for me, that tool with which I was most comfortable is the law, which is why I think I was attracted to seeking a position where I could have a role directly in developing the legal framework of our society. For me, the law is one of the most important tools we have to affect progress, to move towards a more equitable society where individuals can flourish in peace and security. Jean-Baptiste Henri Lacordaire was a French ecclesiastic, preacher, journalist, and political activist. And he famously said, and I'll quote it in French and read it in English, "Entre le fort et le faible, entre le riche et le pauvre, entre le maître et le serviteur, c'est la liberté qui opprime et la loi qui affranchit." So between the strong and the weak, between the rich and the poor, between the Lord and the slave, it is freedom which oppresses and the law which sets free. And I think there's a lot to unpack in that, but I leave you with that as support for my view that the law is a very effective tool for progress. And I want to say, you may have extrapolated or gathered, or you already know that I wasn't successful in being elected. But I think, winning is not the only prerequisite to being a part of a movement for progress and change. And so I think the campaign itself and the sharing of ideas and aspirations in the course of an electoral campaign are important components of the pursuit of progress in their own right. So with that in mind, I just want to take a few minutes to share some reflections from a campaign rookie. It was my first political campaign, and so I just want to take a few minutes to share some things that I learned. And I mean, it's hard to distill it because I'd never really been involved in a campaign before, unless you include my very successful 1996 campaign for student council president. So I really had no idea what to expect, not only in terms of the mechanics of a campaign, but also in particular what it would be like to have contact with voters and what kinds of questions they were going to have for me or views that they were going to want to share with me. The most recent election, I think, probably more so than some others in recent history, really forced people to dig deep and consider the type of country that they want to live in. Early in the campaign, I think the Conservative Party really tried to focus the campaign on issues in relation to the economy. But it quickly became apparent that Canadians were ready for a much broader discussion than that, and one which implicated our very identity and the type of society in which we want to live. And there was a lot of rhetoric, I think, in the course of the campaign about change, but I think what people really wanted to see was a more progressive, open, and just government. A government which introduces thoughtful policy for the greater good and not just in the hopes of gaining more votes in the next election. And this was certainly my experience when I went out knocking on doors. people were clearly taking their decision very, very seriously, and they were deliberating very conscientiously over their choice in terms of who they were going to support in the election. And I was asked all kinds of really interesting and thought-provoking questions, and it really demonstrated for me people's own personal visions for progress in this country. I do think that ultimately there was a segment of the population that was so obsessed, rightly from my perspective, with the idea of defeating the incumbent government, that I think the need for change overtook necessarily high-level ideas about progress. So what I've been reflecting on a lot lately, which is a sliver of what I've learned from my experience in being a candidate, is in relation to the role that certain digital tools played in the course of the campaign and potentially impacting the outcome of the election. There's been a lot of talk during the campaign and since that time about democratic reform and looking at whether there's potentially a fairer electoral system that we might consider adopting. And I hope in the course of those deliberations that some thoughtful analysis is made of the use of online tools that were very present in the course of this campaign. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of them without any particular judgment as to whether they're useful tools or good tools, but just some things to think about that I think are worthy of reflection. I think social and other digital media have been shown to have a really important impact and a lot of potential for making the democratic process more accessible to more people. And I think that's very important. Information about parties and their policies, I think, can now be consumed in a number of different ways across many different platforms. But with this great accessibility has come, I think, certain potential downsides that I think are worth highlighting and looking at. The concern I have is that it's become easier and easier for people to effectively outsource their own assessment of the parties and the policies that they're presenting in a campaign. So there were a number of different tools. One of them, and again, I say this without any judgment as to their quality. I think a lot of them were really great, interesting, innovative tools. But there was a tool called Vote Compass, and a lot of people were looking at that, and when I was knocking on people's doors, it was very clear that a lot of them had used this tool. And it's basically, it's almost like a Cosmo quiz for should you pursue your crush? It's 28, 29 questions, very, very straightforward questions with devoid of any kind of context. And at the end of it, it kind of spits out, you're closer to the Greens, you're closer to the NDP, you're closer to the Liberals, you're a Conservative, and it sort of shows you where you're aligned relative to each of those parties. But the questions, I was looking back at them today actually, and they were things like, how much should Canada spend on foreign aid? More, less, or about the same? That presupposes that people have any kind of idea of what we currently spend on foreign aid. And I think it's more helpful to think about questions like that within the framework of some kind of factual context. Another question was, how supportive should Canada be of Israel? More, less, or about the same? And again, that's an incredibly complex question, and people have all kinds of different views on different components of what our relationship with Israel or other Middle Eastern states should be. So I can tell, when you know a lot about the issues, you can tell where the compass is guiding you based on your answers to various questions. But a lot of the criminal justice policy questions as well were very, I believe, yes or no, that longer sentences deter criminals. Well, that's not even really a question of opinion. There's a lot of evidence and fact that can provide an answer to that. But if you've heard it long enough, in the political rhetoric, you may say that yes, you agree with that, and that's going to point you towards a certain party. So I think it's a useful starting point. It's an interesting assessment tool. But, and I'm not saying there isn't a role for tools like that, but it's something that's really worth thinking about is how many people, it would be interesting to know how many people used a tool like that and then just simply voted on the basis of the answer. And I have no idea what the answer is to that in terms of what the numbers would be. There were also, I think, in this election, a large number of strategic voting websites, which again had as their kind of purpose to guide people who identified themselves as being progressive in the direction of which progressive party to support if your ultimate goal is to ensure that a Conservative candidate was not elected in your riding. And again, I don't even know who was creating most of these websites, so it's difficult to know how reliable they were. And it may be that in our current first-past-the-post electoral system, strategic voting is inevitable and is going to be part of our system as long as we have more than two active parties. But if we're going to be talking about electoral reform, I think these are things that we should be thinking about and looking at. These types of sites really encourage people to, again, outsource their choice by relying on the judgment of the site's creators and whatever kind of model forms the basis of their analysis, whoever these people may be, to determine how to cast their ballots. And then finally, a very front and center tool in this election was the website 308.com, which essentially is a poll aggregator and a projection website based on very complex and I think very sophisticated metrics, offered analysts' predictions for the outcomes in individual ridings as well as within provinces and nationally. It's a very, very impressive, and I took some time to look through the methodology, and it's, for someone who doesn't know anything about it, and I count myself among them, it appears to be very sophisticated. It draws on a lot of different data. It's the brainchild of Eric Grenier, who is a very well-respected political historian and commentator. But I think that, again, the concern that I have with these types of tools is that I fear that polls and projections have gone from what I would call measures of assessment to tools of influence. In other words, while the purpose is clearly to assess voter intention, I believe that people who were strategic voters and part of the Anyone But Harper movement ended up giving pollsters and analysts like Mr. Grenier a lot of power and potential to influence the outcome of the election, because a lot of people felt inclined, I think, to support the Progressive Party, which they felt on election day had the best chance of winning. It's incumbent on voters who are committed to true progress, and I think it's particularly important for the young people in this room to understand to be just especially critical and skeptical of what you see and read online, and try as much as possible to look behind and to expose yourself to a diversity of views and perspectives. Because one of the traps, again, with online and digital tools is it's very easy to direct your own reading into things that already accord with what you think and feel. And I think it's important, especially in a campaign, but all the time, to expose yourself to what other people are saying, even if you profoundly disagree with them, because I think it contributes to you becoming a more critical thinker. My husband is a criminal defense lawyer and a frequent political commentator, and in the election, in the course of the election, he subscribed to all the direct email lists of all the parties. And it was actually very interesting and helpful not to only be reading the perspective of the party that you're already inclined to agree with, but to see what the others are saying, not only about their own policies, but how they're going about criticizing what it is that the party that you're inclined towards might be proposing. And so, especially for young people with emerging social and political consciousnesses, and who are being raised very much more so within this kind of digital age, I just urge you to remember that every time you consume any kind of media, but particularly online media, to be thinking about these things. Constantly question the source of the information that you're reading, and take the time to understand the underlying methodology, and don't blindly follow the advice of a website that you basically know nothing about. You can use these resources as a tool, but they should only be one tool in your voter awareness toolkit. I wish I had more time to explore these issues in greater depth, and I acknowledge that I've really only scratched the surface. But the better we understand how people vote and why the way they do, and I say this not coming from a place of cynicism or that it then helps me get more votes at all. It's to look at that to better understand how we can empower citizens to promote progress through the political process and the democratic process. I was incredibly honored and humbled by my experience of having been a candidate, and I learned so much about so many different things. And even though I've made some comments today about the outsourcing of political decision-making, I also want to acknowledge, like I did at the beginning, how impressed I was by really the level of detail and thoughtfulness that all kinds of different kinds of people were putting into the election. I was really inspired by the dedication of so many volunteers for all the parties and all the ridings, with the level of commitment that people really, every spare minute they had were out working on a campaign to, in part, in the pursuit of the progress that they hope to see for their country. But like I said at the beginning, the pursuit of progress isn't and shouldn't be simply a once every election cycle kind of undertaking. As engaged citizens, it's incumbent on each and every one of us to find ways to pursue progress every day in everything that we do. And we need to commit ourselves not only to changing the things that we cannot accept, but to keep fighting to nurture the things that represent the best of who we are as a society. Thank you.